Hey everyone. So this is going to be the first in kind of a history of series. I don't know how many of these I'm actually going to do, but I'm going to do them for the watches that I own and I'm passionate about, which at the moment is really just this one. So I was obviously trying to learn a bit more about my Rolex Explorer, the history of the watch, and everyone knows the same stories, so I'll kind of probably briefly touch on things we've all heard, but I do want to tell the actual history that I've learned about the Explorer. It may be different than what you guys have heard. There's a lot of contradicting and confusing information out from the beginning up until the 80s, but I kind of just want to take you guys on a little walk through the history of the Rolex Explorer. So obviously everyone knows the story of Sir Edmund Hillary. He was a British explorer who climbed Everest, but Rolex was putting their watches on climbers 20 years before him, since around the 1930s, so even pre-World War II, and his was the obvious first one that kind of launched this entire new series, but he wasn't actually wearing an Explorer. From what I can tell based on the internet, he was wearing a reference 6098. That's because at that time Rolex was making the 6098 and the 6150, which were kind of like souped up Oyster Perpetuals. They were fairly common looking watches, but they were touted by Rolex to be more robust and more durable than the standard models that were out there. So he was given one. The stories that I've read said he didn't even really own the watch, and he was expected to give it back at the end of the expedition. But him and his guide were both given them. Obviously it went great, but they were not actually wearing a Rolex Explorer. Due to the success of that expedition, the first actual watches to come out that touted the Explorer name were the 6298 and the 6350, which were somewhere in the 1952, 1953, 1954 region. Some 6150s going all the way back did have Explorer written on them, but those were produced somewhat later into the 53 and 54 years. The 6350 reference was the first Explorer, and it was also chronometer certified. And on almost all examples of it, they do say Explorer. But while the 6150, when it occasionally did have the word Explorer, it was down at the 6 o'clock position. This moved it up to under 12 o'clock, under Rolex, and under where it says Oyster Perpetual. So the 6350 is kind of the very first commonly known and highly collectible version of the Rolex Explorer 1. This was also the first Rolex Explorer to feature the 3, 6, and 9 markers on the dial. Previously, they looked like Rolex Oysters, where they just had the normal hour markers. So this was the debut of seeing the 3, 6, 9, which is now commonly what the Explorer is known for. Little nitpicking here also, I don't love when people say Explorer 1. You have the Explorer and the Explorer 2. Explorer 1 is really not a term. It's not something you should say, and I'm going to judge you for it. Kidding, but not kidding. So those watches were obviously very successful and started a whole new kind of desirable market for Rolex of people wanting a more robust but not as thick Submariner-like sports watch. So in 1956, they came out with the 6610. They put a new movement in it, which was also the caliber 1030, and it came out in multiple faces. I have some photos here provided by Hodinkee of the 4 main dials. There was the first one, which was somewhat standard, but it had the depth rating written in red on the face. There was next the albino dial, which was a white Explorer, which I think is really cool, and I would wish they would bring this one back. One that had what they're calling the lollipop second hand, which you'll see here why. And then they had one that had what were also the lollipop hands with smaller lume dots and a slightly different bracelet. This watch was almost, I'd say, perfect in their eyes and collectors' eyes, but Rolex made one little tweak fairly soon, in right around 1960, when they released the 1016. Now, the 1016 was the longest running Explorer they released, and it ran for 30 years. This thing ran until 1989, which is insane, because now Rolex is releasing updates to watches all the time. But when they released the 1016, it had the caliber 1570 movement in it, was also chronometer rated. But from what I could tell, somewhere along that 30-year period, they did change the movement. But that's another one of those areas that's a little murky. Some places say they did. Others places say that it wasn't an actual movement change. They just slightly made some corrections to it and still called it the same 1570. But interestingly enough, in that 30-year run, they did release the Explorer 2, which was the first black dial version, in 1971. So clearly they knew they were onto something, but then they had a market for a similar type of robust watch that, from the marketing perspective, you have the Explorer, you have the Sub-Out. I'm not really sure where the Explorer 2 fit in since I wasn't alive then, the audience, but they clearly wanted a more bulky, larger-sized Explorer, so in 1971, Explorer 2 was released. Now, up until all of these watches, they all featured acrylic crystals, which... obviously, if you're exploring and doing some rugged lifestyle, acrylic isn't the best, although, Hesalite and stuff like that went to the moon. That was a separate reason. Don't want to dive into the Speedmaster yet, but that was because if it broke, you didn't want glass shards and sapphire shards flying around. Acrylic was better. But now in the late 1980s, they released the 14720. And this was right around 1989, from what all the... publications say. Obviously, some probably came out in 88, some probably came out in 90, but this did have a sapphire crystal. This also had the 3000 series movement, which is kind of the grandfather to all the current Explorer movements that they use today. They're all somewhere in that 3000 series. And this watch was around for about a decade. As you could tell, this is where they start to enter the more logical Rolex, in my mind, references, because the next watch that came out was in around 2000, and it was the 114720, and that had the 3130 movement in it, which was the second generation of that previous 3000 series movement. This watch was very popular all the way up until another 10, so they're running every 10 years here, and that's when the 214-270, the one I currently own, came out, which had the 3132 caliber movement and was finally 39 millimeters. All the previous versions were mostly 36. There were some 34s in there, but the 36 was the size they kind of locked in on. But as you see in my watch, the one I own, the 3, 6, and 9 were not loomed, they were white gold. And apparently this was not liked by a lot of people. So shortly after, they released the Mark II, still under the reference 214-270, but with the luminous hands. And they've kept the luminous hands through today. But that's why I bought the Mark I, because I think that's going to be a collector's model, because it was a short-lived, somewhat of an error or oversight of what they thought people would want. So they put out white gold 3, 6, and 9, and not loomed hands. And I love it, and I think it's cool, and that's why I prefer the Mark I. And that ran all the way until last year, when they came out with the 124-273, put it back to 36 millimeters. It was the caliber 3230 movement, and they finally released that two-tone, which from what I could tell is not a widely popular watch. But now, back to its origins, the Explorer is in 36 millimeters, loomed hands, and that's where we are today. I'm happy to have taken this little dive. I'm happy there's a lot of websites out if you want to dive in more on this. I got a lot from Hodinkee. They did an article on this, which I kind of picked and chose some facts from. But let me know what you guys think about this. Obviously, I'm not a pro at doing these. This is a new series format for me, but I like learning about watches, and I want to share what I learned with you guys. So this is my take on the Explorer, and I'll see you guys next time.